So, my name is Cliff Robinson, and I am the Public Humanities Specialist here at the Princeton Public Library. On behalf of the library, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I'd like to say we are grateful to our partners and to you for trusting us to host this panel on treaty agreements and responsibilities. We've recognized our role as hosts as an honor in itself. Thank you to Suzanne Akbari, Melissa Moriton, Ian McCallum, and Maria Mercedes Tuya for bringing us all together. Thanks to the panelists for sharing their knowledge with us today. And thanks to the audience for joining us in person and virtually. So a couple days ago, Suzanne communicated to me that in a course on the university's campus, a student asked why the Princeton Public Library had become involved with the Munsee Language and History Symposium. I think this question is a reasonable one and deserves a response. In the first place, I'll bring up the library's mission, that is to connect everyone in our dynamic and growing community by advancing knowledge, encouraging dialogue, and providing opportunities for discovery and joy. This mission is served by a number of goals and strategies, but one way in which we at the library serve the public is to form partnerships and host events such as this one, which aligns with our mission in every possible way. We hope that through this program, we can serve as a space where the circle of participants in the symposium can appear before the public outside of the academic spaces at the university and the institute where this important work at Princeton has proceeded thus far. But more than that, it has seemed to us that the library can be a more informative resource and a better community connector by listening in on this panel and discussion today, an opportunity in itself for discovery and joy, and in this way advance our own knowledge and the public's alike. So with that said, I want to bring a little more quiet to my own role as a representative of the library and to offer up the space to our panelists. So the topic of this panel, as I already said, is treaty agreements and responsibilities. The panelists will be discussing how treaty agreements established by wampum belts, just as the GJ wampum belt from Munsee-Delaware Nation, around which the convening this morning was gathered, were upheld or neglected both on Lunaapahkiing and in the Lunaape diaspora. So our first presenter, John Moses, will speak on the history and application of repatriation policy at the Canadian Museum of History. Then Mary Jane Logan McCallum will join us virtually to share her presentation, Dutch Pageant at the Town Hall, 1924, Purchase and Disappearance at the Tercentenary of the Settlement of New Amsterdam. Finally, Joanne Gardner Schedler will present Stockbridge and Munsee Treaties, honoring our ancestors. Following that, we'll have time for discussion with the panel, and then we'll wrap up by 6 p.m. At that point, I ask that members of the public who are here to see the panel please exit the room because we have a private event scheduled for immediately after the public part of this event. So I'll thank you all for your attention. I'll also say if anyone wants to come up and take these seats more in the middle of the room, we do have more seating available there, and you should feel welcome to do that. I hope that you will if you want to. So thank you all for your attention, and John, we're ready for you.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm going to commit heresy here and introduce myself in Mohawk at a Lenape language symposium. that in itself is I think, an indicator of our fraught and contentious history. It's a long story, and I'll be happy to talk about it later on this evening. But that's it. Everything's fine. No, that's good. So, Sego Skena Gawaga Sawadas Moses Young Yats, Ganyats Young Wahoi, Ganyats Hodnoshoni, Kanyen'kehaka Tano Lene Lunape. My name is John Moses. I'm a member of the Delaware and Upper Mohawk bands from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory near Brantford, Ontario, Canada. That's where both my parents were born and raised, and where the majority of my extended family members continued to live and work. My father was the late Russ Moses. He was a residential school of the infamous Mushhole, the Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School. He was also a Korean War veteran and a public servant who played a leadership role in the groundbreaking Indians of Canada Pavilion at Expo 67 in Montreal, which today is recognized as a watershed in Indigenous self-representation before national and global audiences. My mother is Helen Montour Moses. She's 94, and she followed her own mother, Edith Anderson Montour, into the nursing profession, and Helen was one of the founding members of the original Canadian Indian Nurses Association back in the 1970s, for which work she received her Eagle Feather. But anyways, I'm telling you all of this information just so you know exactly who I am and where I'm coming from in all respects, and what informs my thinking on many things, including the work that I do in my day job, which is Director of Repatriation and Indigenous Relations at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec, Canada. CMH is Canada's National Museum of Human History. Now, in, I guess, putting my presentation in context, where this session is about its lands and treaties, I understand, well, most of the repatriation, I'll get into this in greater detail later on, but most of the repatriation work that comes our way at CMH is as a function of our involvement in Canada's modern treaties process, comprising comprehensive land claims agreements and Aboriginal self-government negotiations. Each and every one of those negotiations, and today there's something like 112 that are currently active across all parts of the country, each one of those negotiations has a more or less detailed chapter around culture, heritage, and language. And the basic premise is that just as natural resources have been removed from within traditional territories, and just as tragically and criminally as Indigenous children were removed to residential schools, so too were cultural resources removed to wind up in places precisely like the Canadian Museum of History, and indeed in museums and collecting institutions around the world. So very briefly, CMH recognizes and acknowledges its historical roots as a colonial institution. So yeah, very briefly, CMH recognizes and acknowledges its historical roots as a colonial institution with origins stretching as far back as 1856, including some past collecting practices and assumptions that are, bluntly stated, abhorrent by today's legal, moral, and ethical standards. However, in its more modern history, if you will, CMH and its predecessors have been doing repatriation as a matter of museum best practice since the decade of the 1970s, and we were a global pioneer in this important aspect of museum work, starting with the return of seized potlatch materials taken in 1922 under the old Indian Act bans, back to the Kwagulth communities of Alert Bay and Cape Mudge in British Columbia, and that was in 1978. Before that, again, during the decade of the 1960s, we were the major source of artifact content and interpretive support for the Indians of Canada Pavilion at Expo 67 that I just mentioned. And now, yeah, I would say at CMH, we are grappling with the big picture questions on a daily basis. These include things like, how do we decolonize, indigenize, and unsettle existing colonial institutions precisely like CMH, while setting in place the conditions necessary for brand new Indigenous-led cultural spaces of the future, places where Indigenous experts on Indigenous issues might provide direct, unfiltered Indigenous perspectives on important matters. Who gets to speak on whose behalf regarding representations of indigeneity in the museum and gallery space? And indeed, who is Indigenous, given this continuing phenomenon of exaggerated, if not criminally fraudulent, Indigenous identity claims? And finally, whose values and assumptions inform decision-making processes within museums and gallery spaces, whether for individual ancestor objects and works of art, or for entire monuments, historic sites, and cultural landscapes? Now, circling back to my first question, I want to define my terms here to give you the working definition of particular terms that we use right now at the Canadian Museum of History, and especially within my own responsibility center for repatriation and Indigenous relations, which also includes management of our museum's Indigenous internship program. So at CMH, to decolonize means to view the entirety of our core museum functions through the lens of UN Declaration and the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. These core museum functions comprise collections and research, including conservation, exhibitions and programs, including in the Indigenous internship program, and museum policy administration, including repatriation. Now, again, at CMH, to indigenize, that's largely a human resources term, or people and culture term, as we call it now at our organization. It's a human resources term referring to all of our staffing efforts to attract and retain and promote the career interests of Indigenous museums and heritage professionals, while unsettling, means constantly challenging the notion of Canada as the benign post-colonial settler state, officially multicultural and officially bilingual in French and English. We must make a constant effort to recognize the constitutionally protected Section 35 Aboriginal and treaty rights and to prevent these from being subsumed beneath overarching discussions of Canadian multiculturalism and equity and diversity more generally. It's not that we do not support these notions, these principles, these ideals, but we have to make a conscious effort not to roll in our discussions of Indigenous rights with these broader discussions of equity in general. Otherwise, Indigenous peoples are rendered as merely another tile in Canada's ethnocultural mosaic and is merely another equity-seeking group without recognizing and acting upon the reality of the uniqueness of Indigenous peoples in Canada and our unique rights, Aboriginal and treaty rights that, simply stated, do not apply to other equity-seeking groups in the Canadian Confederation. Now, as to the specific matter of repatriation, the current CMH repatriation policy is a board-approved document, dates from 2001. It was last reviewed in 2011, and it's being reviewed again right now to ensure that it continues to meet or exceed the most recent standards and expectations around museums and their Indigenous relations as articulated in Canada's own UN Declaration Implementation Act, called Bill C-15, and the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. The CMH repatriation policy is what we call a criteria-based policy that prioritizes the return of specified categories of Indigenous ancestors and ancestor belongings that have historically been identified by Indigenous peoples themselves as being the priority items for return. These comprise physical anthropology, i.e. collections of Indigenous archaeological human remains, the burial materials associated with those human remains, Indigenous ancestor objects of a sacred ceremonial or ritual nature, museum materials acquired under conditions of theft, duress, or trespass onto Indian Act reserve lands or other Indigenous traditional territories, property owned in common, meaning, for example, Northwest Coast Clan crests and insignia, Plains First Nations medicine bundles, and germane to the gathering today, Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg wampum items, wampum belts and associated wampum paraphernalia. And then finally, important cultural patrimony or matrimony, as the case might be, meaning objects that are esteemed based on their artistry, their rarity, or their important historical associations. Now, finally, it's important to note that at CMH, repatriation is but one outcome along a spectrum of Indigenous engagement activities that also includes the museum's Indigenous internship program, the CMH framework for Indigenous relations based on principles of access, engagement, and knowledge, our ordinary suite of short and long-term loans, shared custodial arrangements, memoranda of understanding, the provision of digitized copies of archival records, and finally, the repatriation itself, which at CMH is the permanent physical return and transfer of legal title from the museum back to the Indigenous communities of origin. And then also, if I skipped over it, I think I might have, we also have the traditional materials program in space at the Canadian Museum of History as well. So anyways, as important, this is one thing we always want to emphasize, that as important as it is and as high profile as it is right now, we've been doing repatriation at CMH going back to the decade of the 1970s as a matter of museum best practice, and it's but one outcome along a spectrum of Indigenous engagement activities, as I say, that spans the internship program to the sacred materials project in space, and then repatriation itself at the far end of the spectrum, with numerous stopping points in between those areas as well. So CMH is of the point of view that the highest purpose of museums and related spaces is in their capacity to facilitate cultural continuity rather than the mere preservation of often fragmentary remains. In all of these undertakings, CMH deals directly with the Indigenous governments involved on a nation-to-nation basis balancing our obligations under the UN Declaration and the TRC calls to action with our other obligations under our own enabling legislation comprising the Canadian Museum of History Act. So it fundamentally means we will continue to act as Canada's National Museum of Human History with significant Indigenous content, but in this day and age, none of this work is done arbitrarily or unilaterally through the museum's own largely non-Indigenous curatorial staff, presuming to set research agendas and exhibition calendars and that kind of thing. Everything from the outset is done in concert with Indigenous advisory committees, whether at the local, regional, or provincial and territorial level. So anyways, I'll stop there. I just realized that I didn't actually make use of my PowerPoint, so I'll actually motor through that right now. But I do want to talk about, fundamentally, it's the our Indigenous collections, whether it's the ethnology collection or the archaeology collection, form the historic basis of the museum overall, going back to 1856 as a small collection within the Geological Survey of Upper and Lower Canada. The premise at that point being, what better way of getting a handle on the natural resources available within a particular region by, acquiring the curiosities and the other material culture of the Indigenous groups. Obviously, they will be making use of materials that are obtained within their particular traditional territories, taking into mind, of course, the possibility or the likelihood of trade goods being received as well. So anyways, the ethnology collection at CMH comprises approximately 55,000 objects altogether. These range in size from the large totem poles and dugout canoes and house fronts that are on display in the museum's Grand Hall, if any of you have been to the museum previously, down to individual pieces of jewelry and ornamentation. So there's quite a range in the physical size of the materials that we're talking about, 55,000 objects altogether, approximately. In terms of the archaeology collection, because of the unique way of cataloging and registering archaeological sites in Canada, wherein numbers are assigned to the tiniest little fragment and shard and that kind of thing, it actually numbers in the millions of pieces with a time depth going back to approximately 20,000 years. And in terms of our archives, the CMH archives itself breaks it down into a subset of three, comprising unpublished manuscripts, historical photography, and then audio-visual material going back to some of the very earliest cinema footage that was recorded, and then also wax cylinder recordings. Now, sort of, again, just a review of the decade-by-decade evolution of the museum, going back to the decade of the 1960s. I was born in the decade of the 1960s, so history begins in the 1960s as far as I'm concerned. You have to start somewhere, so. Anyways, again, so it goes back to our involvement with the Indians of Canada Pavilion at Expo 67. By the 1970s, we become a global pioneer in repatriation as a museum best practice. During the decade of the 1980s, the current CMH complex called Parc Laurier is under development. Our lead architect, the famous Douglas Cardinal, who's of Blackfoot, Plains Cree, and Métis ancestry. During the decade of the 1990s, we're heavily involved in the Joint Task Force report on museums and First Peoples that was co-run by the Canadian Museums Association and the Assembly of First Nations, and we're also involved in the Culture, Heritage, and Language volumes of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Our Sacred Materials Project in Space comes into being, our Human Remains Policy comes into being, the Indigenous Internship comes into being, and other work is begun that, as of the year 2001, results in the museum's repatriation policy as an honest-to-goodness board-approved policy document. By the time we're into the 20-teens, we're looking at the era of the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission that delivers its final report in 2015. And then also we are involved with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and more recently, the Canadian Museums Association's most recent report on the state of Indigenous and museum relationships in Canada, and that's called Move to Action. So yeah, just more of the same. I've already covered this ground. So again, these are the criteria that form the basis of our repatriation policy right now: the physical anthropology, the associated burial materials, objects of a sacred ceremonial ritual nature, objects acquired under conditions of theft or trespass, property owned in common, and important cultural patrimony or matrimony, as the case might be. Some of the terms that we use in the world of CMH and our working definitions of these things: repatriation is nothing other than the outright transfer of legal title and permanent physical return of objects from the museum back to the Indigenous communities of origin. We have custodial arrangements agreements, which is a form of shared custody. And we've also found just our ordinary suite of short and long-term loans are often, they meet the requirements of the Indigenous group in question. Now, I want to talk about the history of treaty-making process. This is in one map, covers like 400 years of treaty-making in Canada, starting on the East Coast, the era of the Maritime Peace and Friendship Treaties during the 1600s, early part of the 1700s. By the time we're into modern-day Ontario and Quebec, we're looking at the first version of land surrender and cession treaties with the Robinson-Huron and Robinson treaties, Robinson-Superior treaties. By the time from 1871 until 1921, there's a total of 11 numbered treaties, Treaties 1 through Treaty number 11, that are assigned across what today are the Prairie Provinces and up into the Northwest Territories. And then starting in the province of British Columbia, as of 1973, there was a major Supreme Court of Canada decision called the Calder decision that recognized in principle this notion that, yes, indeed, Aboriginal title and rights and various forms of sovereignty survived the application of British and later Canadian sovereignty, is setting in place the conditions necessary for a modern-day treaties process comprising Aboriginal self-government agreements and comprehensive land claims agreements. And especially within the province of British Columbia, overlapping or competing claims. With the exception of Haida Gwaii, there's not one river valley, not one frontage that you can think of in BC that is not subject to multiple overlapping claims. So how does the museum, what role can the museum play in helping to adjudicate those overlapping or competing claims? And yeah, our ongoing questions and priorities: how do we decolonize, indigenize, and unsettle? You know, continuing to balance our obligations under the Museums Act with our obligations under the UN Declaration Act and the TRC, and how do we integrate Indigenous traditional care within the museum setting? And this is something I'd raised in an earlier session. I think we're only just getting past this notion now of traditional care, often forming pipe ceremonies and smudging ceremonies and you know, the generation of smoke and that kind of thing. I think in an earlier era, this was perceived as a potential threat to the collections that had to be policed or surveyed or controlled somehow. In this day and age, in a post-UNDRIP and post-TRC environment, we want to normalize Indigenous traditional care within the museum setting so that things can be done without having, you know, making all of these elaborate arrangements in the sort of the weeks preceding any visit to inform fire marshals or to make sure there's a uniform security guard standing there with a fire extinguisher at the high port, basically getting in the face of the elders and the traditional knowledge keepers and that kind of thing. And again, emphasizing that repatriation is but one outcome along a spectrum of Indigenous engagement activities. So Yahweh, thank you for your time. And I don't know if you're doing Q&A or later on perhaps, or?
I think we have a little time.
Yeah, sure. So I'd be happy to hear any questions or comments or, yeah, sure.
Well, we can talk about, can you hear me? Kanyen'kehaka from the Kanyen'kehaka clan of the Haida Nation. And from our perspective of the Haida Nation, I've worked with John. The Haida Nation has entered into an MOU with the Canadian Museum of History, or whatever you're calling it now.
Yeah.
And in that MOU, it recognizes I was the collection and engagement coordinator for the Haida Gwaii Museum, and now I'm a fellow in conservation. So that's how I've come to know that at AMNH. And just to speak from our perspectives towards this kind of work is that, you know, it is real. It is actually happening. Repatriation is real. The foundations of our relationship is unfortunately based in the repatriation of our ancestors' remains, of which there were over 140 at Canadian Museum of History. And we just completed that process this year, which is an unfortunate reason to get to know each other. But, you know, the ancestors being there paved a pathway for us to be able to kind of bring everything home in a good way and bring everything around in a way that gets all the messy colonialism out of the way and allows us to just talk as humans. And so what the Memorandum of Understanding did was guaranteed that the relationships formed in these difficult processes could go beyond the relationships that, you know, that happen with the people. That institution to institution, there's a foundation for how you're supposed to treat each other. And the language of that, neither of us had it on our cell phones or computers. So, but the language of that is not proprietary information. It's out there and can be used by anybody. And what it does is essentially has the institution recognize our rights and titles over the belonging, and they recognize, and we recognize them as qualified caretakers. And that as now that there aren't, until you open some drawer and find another ancestor, who knows? For now that there isn't any ancestors there, we can begin talking about belongings, or what we call Kanyen'kehaka, because English is so weak. And in doing that, in the future, we can take any gendered notion of repatriation or rematriation out of it. It's just transfer. And so half of our people live off of our nation's territory. I'm a citizen of the Haida Nation. Half of those people live off, and actually about 60, I think, live in Ottawa alone. So I have a responsibility to give our people a place to feel safe in and be around their ancestors wherever they are in the world. And unfortunately, you know, with their displacement also was the displacement of our belongings, and including, so the place in Ottawa now that we've entered into this Memorandum of Understanding, the place in Ottawa can be more like an embassy for our people, that they can come in and see their ancestors' belongings and hear from their ancestors' stories and hear from their cousins. And I'd just say that, you know, just speaking from the nation point of view, it's real. You know, this work is actually happening, and that's rare for us to hear, right? So it's, you know, we can be uplifted anyway. So I just wanted to comment on John. He's not lying.
Okay. Thanks for that. I appreciate it. Take that as a win. That's good.
Do we have any other comments or questions? No? Okay, well, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a question. Sorry. I was really troubled this past summer. It's not a secret because I did let the organizers of this conference know, but when I was in Paris, you know, it's the 4th arrondissement, and I see there's First Nation and Indigenous works of art that are in private stores and boutiques, and I don't know, like, and then I was in Brussels and I see a store, and they have a headdress, and it looks like human hair dangling from the headdress, Plains Nation, and then I contacted an elder who was Blackfoot, and he did confirm, indeed, it is a headdress from possibly his nation or one of the neighboring ones. So, and then I think about all these tiny little museums dotted across the landscape, like in Pennsylvania, for example, that does not acknowledge Delaware or Lunaape. The federal government, you know, who's responsible? Like, you know, I'm not saying that it's going to be, let's say, the National Museum, maybe to police that, but we're talking about repatriation, but the artifacts are so widespread. Like, I mean, I just feel like there's displacement all over the place, and a lot of it from Canada and a lot of it from the U.S. And,
Well, I think going back for, you know, a couple of decades now, at least back into the 80s and into the 90s, there's been more or less coordinated efforts just to get a handle on what exists within public museums around the world. And whether you're talking about Haida material or material from my community at Six Nations, like I've personally encountered stuff from up and down Third Line at Six Nations, from the National Museum of Argentina in Buenos Aires to the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg and stuff like that. It's almost an impossible task to know what is out there within private hands, because the private collectors typically do not publish or publicize the nature of their collections for all sorts of security and privacy reasons and that kind of thing. And even when these things occasionally emerge on the international market, like at some of the big auction houses like Sotheby's and who else? Sotheby's, well, you know the names. Those auction houses guarantee anonymity and privacy to the person so that they can sell their sell their collections if they choose to do that. And indeed, there's a movement out there within the private art movement that property rights are human rights. So they're arguing, well, this is my private collection, this is my property. I'm invoking section whatever of the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Property rights are human rights. So, and indeed, they, demand the right to continue selling, notion of willing seller, willing buyer, and that kind of thing. But the bottom line, it's next to impossible to determine what remains in private hands and private collections around the world. No doubt there is stellar material out there that in the years to come will emerge on the private market. Some of the wampum belts we've been talking about, perhaps they're to be found in years to come. We'll suddenly see a notice or catalog from Sotheby's or Christie's, and lo and behold, there's a new William Penn wampum belt being offered for sale, or whatever. But anyway, but thank you. Yeah.
Ani, my name is Amanda McLeod. I'm from Segang Anishinaabe Nation in Manitoba, so I'm Anishinaabe Kwe. I just wanted to speak on that because I actually am part of GRASAC, so it's the Great Lake Research Alliance for the Study of Aboriginal Arts and Culture. And so for that one, in that way, we actually, the members, we go out to these institutions where we realize that they have collections of Great Lakes objects, and we have this database that we're building on. And the way that we actually identify is just through networking and talking to people, because I worked with Dr. Maureen Matthews at the Manitoba Museum for 4 years, and so her and I actually at the beginning of December are going to be going out to Slovenia, to Ljubljana, because she had gone to a conference and she talked to a curator there who happened to say, like, oh yeah, we have a huge collection of Great Lakes objects in Slovenia, and we kind of went like, what, really? Okay. So we're going to go out there and we're going to document what they have, and it's kind of the first steps of creating a relationship with that institution, and hopefully we let everybody know what's there, and then in the future it may be steps towards repatriation. But it's one of those things where it's daunting to think about like how many institutions out there have objects from the Great Lakes region. And it's just through word of mouth that this organization is growing, so people are starting to be more open to having us as researchers come into their collections, because for a long time there was that reluctance, because there was that idea of repatriation, and especially in Europe, they were very against repatriation. As soon as you mentioned it, it's like they would clam up and just kind of lock down the barricades. But there's quite the movement now to kind of have that dialogue between. So that's, I guess, in terms of the Great Lakes region, that's how we're kind of very slowly kind of just chipping away at what's out there in the world. Private collections, we don't really have people contacting us for that, so don't really know how we're going to function with that.
Hi, thanks. I was wondering if you have advice for people working in institutions about how to, make progress and sort of start pushing for more beyond NAGPRA, let's say, or in the US, or just beyond sort of the ways that people have done things for a long time. when you were developing these policies or MOUs with communities, did you face pushback from administration at your institution, or do you have advice for people on how to navigate those conversations that can be difficult sometimes?
Yeah, well, certainly there are, some opinions and values are, deeply held and they're entrenched. And to be quite frank, in some cases, it's a matter of waiting for, people retire and, move off the scene, and there's a new generation emerging all the time. It's certainly been a welcoming development over the past, 10 or 15 years that every year within Canadian borders anyways, there's an increased number of Indigenous graduates across the range of the museum and heritage-related disciplines. So those are the people that we would like to be recruiting as people like myself take our retirement and that kind of thing, start nurturing the next generation. But the problem that we're finding is that because the universities in Canada right now each have such robust Indigenous recruitment initiatives, a lot of the new graduates are being re-recruited directly back into academia. And so we have we frankly, in many cases, we can't match the material benefits, the signing packages and everything else like that. So we have to position ourselves, we have to make ourselves appear an employer of choice and a career destination of choice through focusing on other means, and that's being able to demonstrate to people, and this is where CMH still needs to work on it. We need a vice president Indigenous, we need dedicated representation at the board level, one each for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And, from my perspective, the writing's on the wall. Really and truly, the time has come for a national Indigenous exhibitions and research centre in Canada alongside the range of the other, existing national museums. If Canada can have a National Museum of Immigration, if we can have a National Policing Museum, surely to God, we can have a National Indigenous Exhibitions and Research facility of some sort. So. But yeah, they're deeply held values that some people have, and they're entrenched. It's part of their DNA, I guess. You just have to wait for people to pass from the scene, and you redirect or recruit others. Now, the other issue too is that you can't, institutions. It's one thing to do the land acknowledgements. They've become, de rigueur at gatherings like this, and doing repatriation. But it's about more than land acknowledgements. It's even about more than repatriation. Again. These things are just points along a spectrum. You have to look at internship programs. You have to look at traditional care spaces, both internal and external. You have to look at, a range of arrangements short of repatriation itself, because quite often that kind of approach suits the needs well enough of the communities in question. So, thanks.
Okay, at this point, I think we have to.
Hi, I just
Okay.
have one comment. A couple of weeks ago in the New York Times, there was an ad by the Heritage Auction Company of New York City. They were advertising a cradle board and a number of other items. The cradle board started at $150,000 for bid. And I went online and got a picture of it in color and posted it on Facebook so people would know the value of something like that and the other items that were listed.
Yeah, well, as many of us in the room know, like the material at the auction houses can go for hundreds of thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars. North of 100,000 isn't unknown, depending upon what we're talking about.
Okay, at this point, I think we'll have to we should thank John. Yeah. Thank you, John.
Nidashinzi, Mary Jane, Logan, McCallum, Ni Nonjia, Inalahi, Shokwiki, and Winnipeg, Manitoba. Named in Lunaape, Nawalotuman Wendaktakwach. I just got back from the release of the final report of the Special Independent Interlocutor for Unmarked Graves and Burial Sites associated with Indian residential schools. And so this was reported in the news in Canada quite extensively last night. And it's a really important study. It's a lot like, one of those massive studies that the Canadian government does like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but this one was very much led by Indigenous people. And what has come out of it is a national framework for dealing with the issue of what they're calling disappeared children from institutions, including Indian residential schools and hospitals in Canada. It is amazing. The event was incredible. A couple of important things to know about it. Again, they're using the language not of missing kids, missing children. They're using the language disappeared, which borrows from kind of international human rights terminology. And says that basically these are intentional and deliberate acts that were behind the deaths and burials of children at residential schools, including the now kind of desecrations of burials of First Nations inmates at residential schools, hospitals, and other institutions. So that language of starting to use disappeared as opposed to missing pushes, I think, our, how we see Indigenous history in Canada. Another thing that the report does is it suggests that we need an independent 20-year-long Indigenous commission of investigation into finding those who were disappeared in these institutions. So this is sort of suggesting that the legal framework within Canada to study these things is very insufficient. So like our access to information laws prevent us from seeing documents that would be helpful in finding children. But also, like, the Canadian government really can't investigate itself. It's not capable of being independent in this kind of way. So it's launching, it's making this, they're not saying recommendation, they're saying obligation. They're putting an obligation on the state to do this kind of 20-year commission of investigation. And the third thing that this report does is it argues that settler amnesty and a culture of impunity has protected perpetrators and shielded the state from accountability. And so this is a long overdue conversation in the country. Not only is like residential school denialism pretty widespread here, but also we have never really understood state Indigenous relations in Canada as involving crimes against humanity. And looking at Indigenous people as kind of survivors of genocide. These are still, kind of in denial for many people in Canada. And so I think this report's really important for changing our conversation in lots of ways in Canada. And it is because really of the survivors of the schools and elders in communities that have really got us starting talking about these things. And I believe that one of these elders is in the group there. I know she's in New Jersey, but I don't know whether she's in the crowd. Wilma Snake, who's part of the survivors group at Munsee, the Munsee Lunaape warriors, who are doing that kind of work that is hoping to commemorate and reconstruct that kind of history of residential schools in a way that centers on Indigenous people. So I saw a film that Wilma Snake was in, as well as a couple of other people from Munsee. So it was very cool yesterday. Anyway, so my talk today is about, it kind of deals with some of these issues of, disappearances, but also of genocide and of commemoration. So you know what, I'm gonna actually, oops, it's not letting me move. How do I move here it is. Okay, here we go. I'm gonna move forward to this one actually. So a while ago, a friend of mine named Elizabeth Graham, who studied the history of Mount Elgin and the Mohawk Institute, sent me this when she was hearing about some of the commemorative events that were happening in 2024 around Dutch settlement of Manhattan. And so this is a character, Oscar Anton, who we're both really interested in. And this was a piece of like a newspaper for probably musicians or people interested in musical theater in New York. An elaborate Dutch pageant was staged at Town Hall, May 15th, celebrating the 300th anniversary of the settling of New Amsterdam. So there's all kinds of people involved, including a well-known Mohawk singer, and Remington Schuler, and I hope that I'm saying these names right, because I'm actually not sure on the pronunciation of some of the Dutch names I'm going to talk about. But anyway, here he is, and he's at the Dutch pageant, and as we might guess, reenacting some form of the purchase of Manhattan, which is a big part of this this celebration. So anyway, that just sent me down this rabbit hole of what the heck is going on here in Manhattan in 1924. So, 100 years ago, they're celebrating the Tercentenary. What are they doing? How are they doing it? What does it say about the kind of understanding of white settlement and Indigenous people in North America at that time? And so I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about commemoration, its importance to sustaining colonial myths of peaceful European possession in North America and Indigenous disappearance. And I'm going to talk about the time period 1920s. So this is a period of kind of nation building for Canada anyway. It's after the First World War. And it's also for First Nations people in Canada, a devastating period for Indian policy, restrictive Indian policy on First Nations, cultural and political organizations. There is also at this time First Nations career performers that are, from the 1880s to the 1920s, ostensibly living in New York City, including Oscar Nanto. Okay, here we go. Here's the Tercentenary program that was handed out. So 100 years ago, the 300th anniversary of Dutch settlement in Manhattan gripped the imaginations, speeches, art, and entertainment of Americans from children to adults, academic historians to socialites, everyday neighborhood associations to Dutch cultural and heritage organizations. One example of this historical commemoration, which really continued for several years, 1924, 25, 26, was the quote-unquote Dutch pageant held at the newly built New York City Town Hall, which was a kind of progressive theater. It's not a city hall, it's actually theater. It's an auditorium and a club for political education and discussion. This is a celebration that's organized by a group called the Historical Roundtable of the Town Hall. So a group of white settler suffragist women, probably aged around 40 to 60, who one observer stated were interested in the romance and the founding and growth of the city. So the roundtable was chaired by Mrs. Henry Addison Alexander, who was Eleanor Roosevelt's mother, while the Dutch pageant committee itself was chaired by Mrs. Schuler Nelson Warren, who, they were an import business on the New York Stock Exchange. So they were wealthy individuals. The committee and the cast members were from wealthy families descending from Dutch settlers and included Mary King van, here we go, Rensselaer. No one's gonna, if you're correcting me, I can't hear you. Anyway, so she's an author, a historian, and she was a founding force behind the City Museum of New York, actually, which was founded in 1923. And then also members of all kinds of other Dutch families. So I used newspaper records to take a closer look at the pageant itself. So the pageant as a form is this popular turn of the century kind of art form that's part theater and part art. And it's part reenactment. There's song, there's art in the background, and they became very important for nation building and developing kind of propaganda and myths around a nation's history. Particularly celebrating capitalism and white supremacy and obscuring the violence of settler colonialism. So there's several scenes that are involved in this Dutch pageant. There's a school in New Amsterdam, it's called, where we have a teacher and a number of students at the school. We have the Dutch wedding that celebrates, of course, monogamy and heteronormativity. And we have an address on toleration from a kind of religious figure. We also have an ancient ballad of the fisherman, which was, a Dutch, important Dutch cultural song. And many of the cast members took on roles of their direct ancestors. But as far as I can ascertain, there were no Delawares performing as part of this event. All this serves, of course, to basically, I guess, imply the disappearance of Delaware people, culture, and life. And then also celebrate the propagation of white settlers, and to kind of underscore that all the proceeds from the Dutch pageant were to be directed towards the dedication of 2 chairs, each to commemorate the first-born white kids on the island of Manhattan. So those chairs were given to the town hall to have as part of its theater. So part 1, of this pageant is the purchase of Manhattan. It opens, as you might have already guessed, with the purchase of Manhattan from the Indians. So it featured Peter Minuit, the first governor of the colony, and quote unquote an Indian chief. And here's a page from the program. Here you can have a look at it. The purchase, to use a phrase developed by Jeannie O'Brien, is a quintessential first thing and last thing in her book, Writing Indians Out of Existence in New England. She studies 19th century local history texts from New England. And she identifies this important pattern regarding the writing of local history. So she says local writers worked mightily to root New English social order deeply. In effect, they claimed to be the first people who established cultures and institutions worthy of notice, thereby declaring the invalidity of Indian ways of life. Indians serve the larger story line by basically establishing the primacy of English, English social order. And then they're replaced by the true owners of the land, the kind of white settlers, white English settlers. And then there's this narrative of Indian extinction that follows. So this is kind of a helpful way to think through some of the aspects of the purchase of Manhattan seen in this pageant and the rest of the pageant that follows. Here's a kind of up close discussion of that page, of that image that's on the page. So this is a history that starts with a neutral purchase, an enactment for Dutch of neutral, intelligent, and cordial kind of transaction. And the art form of the pageant kind of really gets this across. There's a book called The Technique of Pageantry from 1921 that says, acting in pageants was to be formal, impressionistic, and the staging informal, and kind of like pantomime. So this reflects a kind of community-based nature of the pageant form. So there's this dramatic center or beginning of American history in pageants, where Indigenous people meet newcomers, and it's impressionistic. There's not a lot of talking. There's not a lot of rootedness in records or memory. But it's kind of, I guess, probably understood as, part truth and part art form. And here's a couple of other, because this purchase is evident in all kinds of mostly 19th century depictions. The pageant form makes everything sort of artistic and community driven, and then it kind of gets into people's heads as common sense. And this is what is called the white possessive logic by an Australian scholar of Indigenous studies. And I'm just like forgetting her name right now. So she says there's this logic of patriarchal white possessiveness. And this was a way of rationalizing and affirming European ownership, control, and domination of territory. So this idea that land can be purchased and it can be owned is really important to understanding, I think, the colonial logics of what's happening here, which is, I think, important for us to know because, we need to know how these things worked to understand where we are today. And we, like people, there's these stories about the purchase of Manhattan involving beads. Some of them talk about owning wampum beads. And so we know this to be likely treaty. However, it has never, ever been explained that way in a kind of white possessive narrative of the event. So it might have momentarily reflected a brief kind of mutually beneficial relationship, but the real violence that follows is not really of interest in these pageants, right? First Nations merely become extinct in the story. They're disappeared. And they become, disappeared in real life as well. And this is a story people who study Canadian and American history know very well. Like the purchase of Manhattan happens in 1926. And so there's this they're doing this in 1924. So they're kind of like conflating the settlement and the purchase of Manhattan. And so the chronologies of all of this doesn't really matter. Like the main thing is we own the land now. And I think it's, I don't know if the pageant form is really key to the kind of myth that follows or whether the myth is interpreted in pageant form, but I have a feeling that they kind of work together to mutually support each other through the at least late 19th and early 20th century. Okay, a little bit on Oskanonton. Oskanonton is also called Chief James Deer, also Louis Deer, Louis Deer, also Louis Deer. And also Rowie Oskanonton, as we've been looking him up in the ancestry.com. So he was from Ganawage. He is not to be confused with the famous performing deer family, at least as far as I know. So this would be James Running Deer and his daughter Esther, or Princess Running Deer, who were pretty well-known performers at the time. He is, I don't think, in any way connected to them, but I don't know that for sure yet. So he's an opera singer, he's a baritone, and he's part of a substantial number of vaudeville, Wild West, and formal actors and musicians at this time. He attended Mount Elgin Residential School, which is near Munsee-Delaware Nation, so on Chippewas of the Thames First Nation. And there is a ton of photos of him in the newspaper. And I know a little bit more about this because a woman kind of started collecting all of this information. And I don't have her name on here right now. And she then gave all that information to Elizabeth, who's now shared it with me. Anyway, he has this amazing career. He was in England before he did the 1924 pageant. He has, he writes letters to all kinds of famous people, and he's really well known. There's a short clip of him singing in the British Pathé website, so you can actually go and listen to him if you're interested. He sends his daughter to Mount Elgin in the 1940s, and there are two people who remember him having come to visit. So they remember having a famous opera singer come to visit his daughter at Mount Elgin in the early 1940s. And so this is in tracing his life, there's a lot of questions because it's not always consistent. There's a lot of different stories that are told about his origins and, to the point where he becomes a famous opera singer. So getting some of that reassurance or triangulation, I guess, from oral history is really important here. So at the pageant, he performs this purchase. He also chants Indian folk songs with a number of other kind of Indian vaudeville people. Louis White Moon, who was a Mohawk from Ganawage, also living in New York City. He went to Carlisle. So we also see like a residential school history connected to this. Princess Chickadee, Princess Waska, who I can't locate, Princess Goldenrod, who's purportedly Penobscot, and I think that she retired to Maine after her career. Chief Red Eagle, who was a Haskell Indian Institute graduate. A guy named Jack Beauvais, who I think is just a white guy, a big band singer who they had also performing with this group. Louis White Moon, Chief White Moon, I can't, I think he's from what they say, St. Regis, right? He's a lecturer and a demonstrator. White Eagle and White Feather, I don't know who those people were. And Chief Red Eagle, who was an Iroquois, is a Mohawk. So there has been some work done on vaudeville actors. A book by Christine Bold just came out about this. And she makes the case that these actors, kind of took opportunities that were unavailable to them largely in their home communities. And especially, this is especially true for Canadians or Indigenous people who lived north of the border. And this was a way of kind of maintaining a kind of Indian identity that was unmarked by colonialism and the profound kind of negative influence of really the 19th and 20th century on Indigenous people. So there are no Lenape people, as far as I know, involved in this or other Manhattan Purchase scenes. But I think it's very interesting that we have, someone who we're kind of diplomatically connected with, at least in a kind of cultural and political way, who is undertaking this role. The woman who collected all of this information was Jennifer Mills. Sorry, she was a PhD student at University of Toronto for a while. So a little bit about what's happening at Munsee at this time, 1924. Significant, losses and repressive Indian policies going on. So it's really this is an argument Christine Bold makes, that we have this flourishing of Indigenous performance happening at the very same time that we have a real closure of the possibilities for First Nations people on reserves. So at home, bands along the Thames River were, through new and older measures of the Indian Act, being brought under the control of the Department of Indian Affairs. So the band election system is really important to this. I think at Munsee, it was probably in operation for about 20 years, but there was, in 1924, a challenge by John Tomago, who he said was the oldest male grandson of John Tomago, a hereditary chief. And he wrote to Indian Affairs and said basically that this entitles him to now be the chief. He gets a response from Indian Affairs that says, no, we have the band election system now. You can just drop your efforts there. At the time, the chief at Munsee was Cornelius J. Logan, and counselors included two of Jacob Dolson's sons. So Jacob Dolson, who gave the belt to the Museum of Natural History. So two of Jacob's sons were Daniel and Nicodemus, and so we know many band members come from those families. There's a general concern at the band level, at the level of First Nations at Munsee and other bands in what they call the Indian Agency. So this kind of region that's regulated by an Indian agent, that the Indian agent here in the middle, Thomas McCallum, was a scoundrel and a cheat, and was stealing money from the band. And that he didn't like First Nations people. He was treating people badly. He was talking about people very badly. And so there was actually an effort to do an investigation on him. And that's a picture of from the Border Cities Star, which is, I think, kind of Detroit, Windsor newspaper that, hasn't stood the test of time, I don't think. But this is the study. There was a lawyer from Windsor who heard all of the complaints. I haven't been able to find the documents related to that commission yet, but we have here McCallum, another representative from Indian Affairs, as well as the First Nations men who were bringing forward these complaints and airing the issues that they were facing. First Nations had and others had just come through the First World War, and this gave the experience for many of being away from the reserve. And the League of Indians of Canada and other political organizations formed to really push for Indigenous rights, but also like equalizing Canadian society and identifying and addressing racism. The response of the federal government to that through Duncan Campbell Scott was to clamp down on political organizations, basically making it illegal for First Nations to spend band money to go to a political event or a gathering like the one I just came from for the release of this report on disappeared children. He also made it illegal for people to, at the time in the Indian Act, it was legal to practice ceremonies, to wear regalia, to buy alcohol. And they made, in the 1920s, enfranchisement involuntary for some First Nations people who they felt, should drop their legal entitlements as First Nations people. So it's not an excellent time in the 1920s at Munsee. And I think that there's a lot more that we can learn about this era. And it, I think all of this history is just fascinating. And I don't know, I hope you're kind of getting the connection, I guess, between that era of the creation of the wampum belt and the donation of it to the museum, and also the other things that are going around in kind of Munsee social history at the Thames River. I think that there is really systemic and widespread and enforced disappearances, for example, to use the language of the report, that are happening in the schools at the time. So there's an ongoing experience of genocide. And this is happening to Munsee people, like at Munsee at the time. So this year, obviously, our commemoration is of the settlement of New York has been very different. There's been a number of efforts to explicitly take control of the narrative. The City Museum of New York and members of the Lunaape community have held a We Are Still Here Lunaape celebration in May. There is also an effort to have an exhibition both in Holland and in New York City to think about that history, that 400 years of Lunaape survivance. I think sometimes in those exhibitions, it's very hard to kind of condense 400 years. You can't really get down to the granular level of, band elections at Munsee, for example. So we kind of back up and we see those exhibitions often, and this, you see this in all kinds of Canadian museums, but is often presented as a kind of three-part narrative. You have the everything was excellent before contact. You have this contact and decline and colonization, and then this parallel argument about resistance. And I kind of wonder about how we might mix up that really tenacious kind of narrative that we've got, and tell different stories about those three things in different ways. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about. The people I've ever said this out loud to, so thank you for listening. And I know it's 4:30 and we only have like until 5. Is that right? No, it's 6 for you guys. So I don't know if you want to just leave questions till the end and let the other speaker go, or I will leave that to the chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Jane. Thank you. Yeah, next up is Joanne Gardner Schedler, who will present Stockbridge and Munsee treaties honoring our ancestors.
Kolomasi, Konamasi, Nidushinzi, Kishokwi Pokwa, Ninonjiai Mohicanu. My spirit name was given to me by a young council member that I worked with several years ago. And it's called, he named me the rising mist in the ray of sunshine woman. And being on my tribal council several years back, it was wonderful for me to be able to go to a council meeting. We're from Wisconsin, I'll tell you a little more about that, where all the other tribal leaders would speak in their language and introduce themselves. And we have been starting the last several, 20-some years, learning our Munsee language back, and it's so wonderful to have had our language speakers from Canada come down and assist us with that. So as an elder, I'm 78 years old. I did not even know I was Indian until I was probably out of high school or even thought about it. So to be able to introduce myself was quite amazing. And I think it shocked some of the other guys. They're like, oh, you know how to say your name. So anyway, I'm from the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohican Indians, and I'm representing myself. I'm not here on behalf of my tribe at all. My relatives, my 2 grandsons are here, my daughter's here, so I'm really happy that they're coming along, because the first time I came back here to the homelands, it's something that many of us who haven't done that and came back, and it's amazing. I was born and grew up in Wisconsin, and never really understand our name of our tribe once I found out I was Indian. What is Stockbridge? Munsee? Oh, we're also Mohican. So understanding that whole thing, I think as I listen to all of you and see that I have who are the Munsee-Delaware people, it's been wonderful to learn that and to go back and start sharing, hopefully, with our other young people who we really are. So to start speaking the language, also we're Mohican, and in the Mohican language had been lost over 100 years ago, so that is starting to come back. So I'm very proud to say when I was on our tribal council that we did approve funding for languages. And so we now have, but to find people is the thing, to be able to teach us and to start getting our own people. I'm happy to say my son, when he retired as a deputy sheriff, really got into the Mohican language. And as you talked about during COVID time, people were online. So he could be at home now and start teaching or learning that. And now he actually is teaching a little bit to some of the children at the Indian Community School in Milwaukee. So as I'm talking about the treaties, I'm learning a lot about treaties because, I mean, treaties are very complicated. And I'm just going to tell you about our tribe, what happened from us about the treaties and look at the different treaties that we've had to go through. So there are several books that I really looked to that one of the books is A Nation, a Statesman by James W. Oberle, who was commissioned by our tribe to write the story at that time of what happened to us because of land claims now still that we are dealing with and what we can and cannot do as a tribal nation or where we are. So this book is great because, and he's talking about a nation of statesmen because many of our ancestors are always going off to fight for us. Those chiefs, those leaders, those diplomats are always going off here in the United States to Washington to try to claim our rights or to say we've been wronged and we need to be, paid back for that or whatever. But this, he lists a lot of all the different treaties, and it's really a great book. The other book is a new one, and I'm happy to say it's from a member, Carol Cornelius, is a member of the Oneida Nation, but she's also could be a member of the Stockbridge and Brotherton tribes. So she is a professor that teaches in Green Bay at University of Wisconsin, and this book is new. It came out last year, and the Wisconsin Historical Society has honored this with a book of the year type of award, and I thought, wow, that's wonderful. And so she writes about the treaties and the things that we've done throughout the, to get to where we are today in a way where she's trying to come from our own voices, whereas when they're talking about how they did the treaties. So these are the two books I'm going to be referring to as we go through this. And it's short. I only have 6 slides. So we talked about the wampum belts, and I kind of left that there because I knew we were going to be seeing this wampum belts. And I know that our tribe, too, has several wampum belts in our library right now, our museum, which is a very small museum. You've seen it. We need a bigger museum so we can actually do more and bring more back, because we just repatriated 2 beautiful powder horns that were in a private collection, and they just were able to show that to us recently. Our veterans sat there, and you could see these were from our warriors from the French and Indian War and from the Revolutionary War. And so the descendants of these 2 people sat there and got to see and hear about that history. It was a private collector, and the reason we saw it is because it was in a book somewhere, and someone said, hey, these are powder horns or whatever, and hey, this belongs to your tribe. So through our historic repatriation officer, who we have a full-time office out in New York, in Williamstown, New York, and she has a staff now, or 3-4. So again, we're saying, hey, this is very important. This is our homelands here, and there's a lot of things that should be repatriated or that were there to go together. I might have been with several of you when we went to reburials in our homelands and getting our ancestors off the shelves and getting them buried correctly with the ceremonies and us being there. It is a very emotional thing to do if you've done that, and still think of all those other people that are there. And so we have our policies about how we do that, and I know every tribe is different. So the wampum belts are, to see that wampum belt and to read about some of the things that Carol talked about with the 6 nations, and when we first started doing treaties together, that there would be wampum belts a part of that. She talks about what the ceremonies were and the protocols that were happening. And when we first started with those treaties and meeting about our land and doing the treaties, at that time they were respected. This is before we got on and lost a lot of our land, I believe. But so the belts were a very important part of those treaties. That's why I asked when we were looking at that belt, well, what does all that mean? Hopefully, because there were oral histories and you had to refresh and renew those every several years. And I think Ian talked about this a little bit, as the polishing of the chain. And they talked about that because that chain could be rusty, you had to get together and polish that again. So in some of those ceremonies, I was thinking about how important that was and how we still do it here, although a lot of that's been lost, by being welcomed in. I told Susan and Melissa, we're welcomed in. My gosh, we're welcome. We come here, we have a place to stay, we have something to eat, we rest. If we don't get here too late, and then we can rest. So So anyway, those are a very important part of that protocol. Having people talk and other people listen. So as they gather, you introduce yourself. It's still, I think, a part of what we're doing today. And you get to say what it is that's important to you. So in that treaty, the protocols, I think, are pretty much documented and followed. A lot of it's been lost, but I think we as tribal people are following those along. It was interesting that protocols, Benjamin Franklin wrote an account of treaties from 1736 to 1762 that he was a part of. So it was really nice that he wrote that down, all those traditional parts of the treaty, not just the words of what was happening. Because if you think about when I look at some of our treaties that we have today, we had treaties that when we were removed from out east and eventually where we are today, we had a lot of different tribes we were dealing with, a lot of different people we were dealing with. We were dealing with states, we were dealing with until I think it was 1790, the Trade and Non-Intercourse Act, that at that time, it was said that only the federal government in the United States could deal and do treaties. Otherwise, like New York at that time, actually, they went above and beyond that. And they illegally were trying to deal with the tribes and push us further west. So, let's see, I'll give you a list of some of these treaties. So these are just some of the treaties throughout the time that our tribe has dealt with, along with some of the other tribes. We were being called the New York Indians, which at that time is when the state of New York and the land groups wanted to take our land. But the first 1794, because we were involved in the Revolutionary War, and then we came home and our land was gone, and we were very poor, so we had the huge loss of our homelands. So after that time, we were in the town, it was Massachusetts, Stockbridge, Massachusetts. That was a mission town. And in that mission town, other tribes came there also, because the Oneidas came for a little bit and they said, we don't like it, we're going. Other tribes who have really lost a lot of their land also came over to Stockbridge mission town, and some stayed. One of the people that was there was one of my ancestors, Bartholomew Calvin. He was a leader, a chief with the Delaware Nation in New Jersey area, and he fought to try to keep their land there, but eventually they left because they were invited by the Mohican people and the people at the town of Stockbridge and that mission. And then eventually they had to leave. And by the time we ended up in New York with the Oneidas, that's when a group of the Delaware people came in and joined with us in Stockbridge. So I love looking at the names on these treaties, just like Ian was saying. That's important, the names. He's more the language person, I'm more the names and what happened to them, and were they in the military, and what happened there. So in New York, they were there for just a short time also. And then the treaties that they had during that time, eventually, again, those New York Indians were pushed further west. We ended up in Wisconsin. We ended up at several different places. We were basically homeless. I think about that. We were homeless without really a land base and really looking for a place to be. I know we were divided up, and when I look at those names, I can see Kill Snakes, I can see Calvins, I can see Jacobs, I can see a lot of different names that are by our tribe today. Kanyen'kehaka was my ancestor also at that time. But there are a few, my grandma was the last one called Kanyen'kehaka. So looking at the names of these treaties are really important to me, besides those ceremonies and what they did. So you could just kind of see at the different places we were in Green Bay. So we're here in Wisconsin, and let's see. The different protocols and things that we had really kind of started going away. So let's see, in 1831, the United States and the chiefs and warriors, we were trying to do our own land claims or land treaties when we were 1831. So we're in Wisconsin and trying to deal with working with the Menomonies and the, they called them the Winnipegos at the time, but they were the Ho-Chunk people that lived in that area. Some of those treaties, we lived there, some of the people started coming there, and then eventually the United States came in and said, no, there were disputes. There were changes in leadership for the Menomonies. There were also difficulties in interpretations. So even though we're all Algonquin speakers, the Mohican, we also had issues of understanding of what are we saying. Like the Menomonies were thinking, oh, you can have some land here, whatever, but where that is and what happened was always ended up in a dispute. So anyway, the United States came in, and of course they took over a lot of the land, and they worked with the different tribes, and ended up with different treaties. Again, here we are, more treaties. We think we have a spot in Wisconsin, and we're along working with other nations to try to make sure that we do. We were in Wisconsin. I should have had pictures so you could have seen that. But in Wisconsin, it was by Lake Winnebago, which is a big lake, the biggest lake in Wisconsin. So we were around that area. And then more disputes happened. Of course, then the farmers and people in that area weren't happy because we had good land by Lake Winnebago. So by 1839, there was another federal law that changed, of course, in the United States, and then they wanted to, the federal government wanted to send all the Native Americans, all indigenous people west of the Mississippi River. So we made it to Wisconsin, here we are, and now we're looking at, now we have to leave. So I think by this time, there were many disputes within our tribe because we had an Indian party, we had a citizen party of disputes of who wants to become a citizen, because then we could stay here because this was good land and we wanted to stay in that spot. But then the Indian party wanted to do something different. And so there was a lot of disputes, a lot of backdoor arrangements and problems. And people then, some of the people ended up going and looking in Minnesota where they said, oh, there's land up in Minnesota, you know, those Indians over there don't care. So maybe you can go up to Minnesota. So some people went up and looked in Minnesota. Okay, we'll look over there. Some then went to look down in Kansas because there was another push to send Native people down to Kansas. So there was some of my ancestors at that time, about 1837, there was a group of Munsees from Canada, because as a part of people went up into Canada, and how did that work? And so about 100 of them wanted to come down, and they stayed by us in Stockbridge, Wisconsin for a couple years, and then they knew they had to look to go somewhere else. So a group of them took boats and traveled down to Kansas. The interesting things about those census at that time is, again, looking at the names. By the time they got down to Kansas, there was people dying on the way down there. There are people that may have joined other tribes. But a lot of them were very dissatisfied and eventually came back to Wisconsin. So it's such interesting how people just got pushed and traveled and lost so much during all that time. 1848, with all these different things, to lose our, because previous to that, I think the government told us, well, you're no longer Indians, you're now citizens. And then, so a group of people, our tribal members are going, no, we don't want to do that. Eventually, they came out and they repealed that act in 1848. And then there are many unratified treaties too with, there's, in Wisconsin, beautiful place for pine trees. And so there was a lot of logging going on. And of course, we had a lot of trees on our land that we had for a short time there in Shawano County. And eventually, by 1856, we do get a treaty that was basically that was our last treaty that we had. And we ended up just before the Civil War. So only a few people got to move up to that area, and then the Civil War breaks out. But, so anyway, that's just a little synopsis of some of the issues that happened with us and all the treaties and the problems. And one of the things that I think is important, this is our powwow, one of our powwows when we first started going with our Mohican veterans and starting having powwows again, because it was okay to have powwows in the 1970s after, you know, our young people wanted to learn our culture and learn our language and start knowing what our traditions are. And so we really didn't start until the 1970s to have powwows. And here's some of our veterans along with Menominee people and some of the other people that came to the powwows. And I do want to talk about honoring some of our people and some of the names I've written down from all those treaties that I've looked at. Some of the Hendrik Apamat, these are some of our Mohican people. Joseph Quinney, John and Jacob Kanyen'kehaka, my ancestors, Captain John Kanyen'kehaka, Bartholomew Kelvin, and Rufus Turkey. I noticed there was a George Turkey that was in some things. I also have George Turkey on some other treaties that I've seen. John Matoxen was a leader, also a minister to our people, was a tribal member. John Killsnake, David Kelvin, which I believe is the son or grandson of Bartholomew. Captain Porter, James Rain, Jeremy Slingerland, Austin Quinney, Zeba Peters. There were a lot of Peters that I ran into. David Palmer, Samuel Stevens, Albert Ellis, Morgan Martin, James Hunt. So those are just a few of the names of the many names that I've seen throughout these many treaties that I believe that we need to really be thinking about and honoring. Last slide, Anishik. Today in Wisconsin, we're buying back our land. Our tribal council, we have a casino, and that's what a big part of that money is used for our programs, buying back the land because we have the 2 townships that we originally got in the 1856 treaty, and the money goes back, 1/3 of that money, or who knows today, but at that time when I was in council, we were using the money to buy our land back again. So we won't get it all, but we will be getting more of that land. We have not only survived, we are thriving as Indigenous nations. And Anishik, thank you so much for listening to my ramblings. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the panelists. Thank you for your presentations. Let's turn right now to questions, comments, anything like that. I believe there are library staff who can run mics, so I see there's a hand back over here. Kim, do you have? Right here.
Yeah, the year 1924 kind of rings a bell because that was the year that the U.S. Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. A lot of people don't realize that Native people were not looked upon or able to vote or even citizens, and yet they were fighting in the military, serving in every way, shape, and form. Anyhow, I'm going to do a talk on that for New Jersey History Day, and it's very complex and involved, but it's a good topic for this year. I think 1924.
Mm-hmm. Right. Do you want to talk about your grandma?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in on that too. 1924, yeah, I don't know what it is about that year, but there was a hugely important year at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory as well, because that was the year within which the Canadian government intervened and the Confederacy chiefs and clan mothers were deposed, and or there was an attempted deposition or disposition of the Confederacy chiefs and clan mothers in favor of band council elections as per the Indian Act of that era. And, you know, I don't want to lecture anybody. We all know that history is not here to make us happy or to feel good necessarily. But that reform movement called the DeHorner movement was a homegrown movement at Six Nations, the Grand River, starts leaving a paper trail by about 1860 with their petitions, whether it's to the Prime Minister or to the Governor General or directly to Queen Victoria. Group of people led by Delaware families and Tuscarora families that actually want to introduce elected band council elections, because by that point, a lot of the Delaware people and Tuscarora people had emerged as some of the more prosperous farming families on the reserve and some of the more prosperous small business owners in terms of mills and, you know, things like that. And they didn't have a full say. They had observer status only under the Confederacy system, because the Confederacy system continued to vest decision-making power in the 5 founding tribes, which are the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. So the Delaware and the Tuscarora don't have a full seat at Confederacy Council. They continue to be concerned about the erosion of the Six Nations land base, and they organized themselves by the 1860s. Throughout the remaining decades of the 19th century, there's a whole plethora of petitions and counter petitions back and forth. Come the time of the outbreak of the First World War, the official stance of the Confederacy chiefs was like, we're like the Swiss, until such time as King George V approaches us officially and formally at the level of international law as an allied nation, or until such time as the German Kaiser declares war on the Six Nations Confederacy of Iroquois and allied Indian nations. We're staying out of this. This is a white man's war. That was a pronouncement that went out, and despite that, there are over 300 Six Nations band members volunteered to fight. So that kind of positive response to the British Empire and the Dominion of Canada war effort was a huge slap in the face to the authority of the Confederacy chiefs and clan mothers. And of those 300, more than 300 who volunteered, 292 finally shipped overseas. Of those 292, there were 38 who didn't come back. They are either killed in action, missing in action, or died of wounds and illness. And so that with losses exceeding 1 in 10 like that, they met the dictionary definition of being decimated. Like 1 in 10 went over, or sorry, you know, all those people went over, more than 1 in 10 did not return. That's decimated. Anyways, all that to say, some of the surviving Six Nations veterans assume leadership of the DeHorner movement in the post-war environment, and they collude with the Dominion government, and it's in 1924 that this big political turnabout takes place. So ever since, you've had those extended families that continue to support Confederacy chiefs and clan mothers versus those that are within the band council system, and then as with any political community, those who are apolitical basically, or who are, you know, they don't involve themselves one way or another. So it's a very complicated history. But all that to say, that big change happened in 1924 at the Woodland Cultural Center right now. They've just opened up a 1924 exhibit to talk about the monumental events of that year and what it meant on the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. So.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you said that, John. When I was going through, this is something I was thinking about when I was going through the records of the elections in the quote unquote CAREDOC agency, which includes Munsee, Oneida, and Chippewas of the Thames. The election records actually at Oneida also talk about the exact same movement happening at Oneida at the Thames. And I don't know, I think that's a really fascinating story. I didn't know that that was also, there were dehorners there. And that they were also opposing the imposition of the Indian Act banned election system there. So I think it's like it all kind of comes to a head, I think, in this really problematic Indian agent, right? So I think people just come together and just they want to air all these difficulties in the commission that happens at the investigation that happens of him. So of course, what's found with Mohican is that he's fine and he gets promoted within Indian Affairs, which is the classic, way that when somebody's problematic as an employee of Department of Indian Affairs at a school, at a hospital, they just get moved and promoted. So that happened in 1924 too.
Yeah, it's a really fraught and contentious history, and like it's divided families, it's divided communities. So again, like on my dad's side of the family, patrilineal side, that's the Delaware. The Moses were at the forefront of the dehorner movement throughout the late 1800s and early into the early 1900s. But on my mom's side of the family, there were those some were apolitical. They just simply wanted to be left alone to keep farming in peace. But others, there was another movement called the Mohawk Workers, and these are people who, in terms of their religious or spiritual affiliation, they were actually Anglican. They were strong Anglicans, but in terms of their politics, they were equally staunch Iroquois sovereigntists. And so basically in my own family, on the Moses side, you have leaders of the dehorner movement. On my mom's side of the family, one of my great uncles was Art Anderson Sr., and he was the recording secretary for the Confederacy chiefs and clan mothers from the 1920s up until like the 1960s. He was at this stuff for like 40, 50 years kind of thing. So had traveled overseas with Tuskegee, had been part of other delegations that went over later in the 20s and 30s and that kind of thing. So it's just, it's given that kind of political history, it's a wonder my parents ever got together being from such, but anyways, they did. Love conquers all. So.
Yeah, well, it does have a kind of gendered and women's history too, right? Because those Haudenosaunee governing forms had roles for women. And in this correspondence around elections, I see appeals to have women be able to vote in the banned election system, which I've never seen before.
Yeah.
So that doesn't happen. Indian Affairs says, no, it's not in the Indian Act, we won't allow it. That doesn't happen until 1951. So, and First Nations people in Canada on reserve can't vote in federal elections till the 6th.
Well, and I'd be remiss if I didn't, and when I was talking about this just earlier on, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about my maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, Edith Anderson Montour. She was born in 1890, and as a young woman, she wanted to be a nurse. That was her calling, but under the Indian Act restrictions of that era, she was in danger of losing her band membership if she achieved any sort of technical or professional credential, because if you were in possession of such a credential at that point, you were considered to be assimilated, and therefore your name would be struck off the band list. So her way around that was to actually take her nurse's training in New York City, and she was living and working in New York City as a public health nurse in 1917. When the Americans entered the First World War, so she served. I get emotional when I talk about this stuff, but she served 2 years in France, didn't get back until 1919. By the time she got back, that previous Indian Act restriction had in fact been lifted. So she returned to Six Nations of the Grand River later in 1919. Met and married my grandfather, raised her own family, including my mother, and she continued working as a nurse and midwife at Six Nations right up until the 1960s, by which time she was into her 70s. But anyway, she's recognized today on a couple of counts. She's the first Indigenous person from within Canadian borders to achieve a credential as a registered nurse, notwithstanding under Canada's bigoted laws of that era. She was obliged to take her training in a different country. And under the Military Voters Act of 1917 and the Wartime Elections Act of 1917, status Indian registered band members who were serving in the British, Canadian, or Allied military forces were indeed, for a brief period of time given the right to vote. So she was a pioneer of Indigenous women's voting rights, and she used to host like a voting booth in her home on the Six Nations Reserve for those band members who chose to participate in the federal and provincial electoral system. So she was a big champion of exercising her hard-won right to vote. And I'll stop.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you.
John and I had a great conversation about that because I'm a retired Army nurse. And so it was wonderful to hear what happened to him and his family, and know that, you know, that your family are nurses too. In 1924, in Wisconsin, or in the United States, tribes were losing everything. Our tribe, through logging, through loss of land, we were just down to a few acres. And you know, the 1920s Depression era, there were no jobs, there was nothing. So there was just a few of those people that hung on because the other people had gone off to work other places and whatever. So we were just down to, in the townships of Red Spring, just a few people hanging in there. Many of our people did go off, the same thing. That's why we became citizens of the United States, because our people in the United States volunteered in higher numbers than any other population. So when they did come back by 1924, they were able to give them the vote. My parents were born in 1913 and 1920, so neither of them were citizens of the United States. They both ended up going to the boarding school on our reservation, and that boarding school was a Lutheran. It was called the Lutheran Indian Mission School. And so anyway, that they went to the boarding schools there, and a lot of the other ones, my grandmother was in Haskell, they were in Carlisle, so they were sent all over the place. So again, to me, it's just amazing that we're still here today. In the United States, there was a thing called the Indian Reorganization Act, which many of you might know, but at that time, that's when our tribe pulled themselves together, and those people that were having their own clubs and trying to keep ourselves together joined, got a constitution and became a federally recognized tribe at that time. So, thank you.
Because that's a huge topic too, that link between, whether it's down in the States, you call it the boarding school system, and
Yes.
in Canada, we
Right.
call it the residential
Right.
schools. That link between residential school attendance and later military service,
Right.
that's something that people need
Yes.
to start really looking into. And certainly with our people in Canada, like during the era of the two world wars in Korea, I'd have to say the circumstances of Indigenous people were unique in relation to the rest of the Canadian population, because although we were still actively being denied the full rights and benefits of Canadian citizenship at home, we were nevertheless at the very forefront in fulfilling abroad what many would argue is that most onerous and profound obligation of citizenship and donning uniform and bearing arms against the country's enemies. So, you know, come peacetime, both in the aftermath of the First World War and again in the Second World War, the irony of having fought just recently for the liberty of small allied nations overseas was not lost upon our newly returned veterans. And so they, you know, revert from a position of relative equality with their comrades during the time they're in uniform and under arms, come back to Canada within those post-year decades, and again, there's an absence of, you know, the basic civil liberties and political and, you know, other rights that people take for granted. So, and I'd have to say too, with our Six Nations people, it was always very much in the context of His or Her Majesty's Indian allies, not allies of the Crown, or sorry, not subjects of the Crown, but allies of the Crown. And there were some interesting petitions that were being sent by the Confederacy chiefs and clan mothers to King George V in England during the time of the First World War. And they're basically saying, look, there are a number of guys, young kids from our reserve who have enlisted in your army overseas and are presently at the Western Front. you know, they're 15 and 16 years old, send them home. And what they've done is they actually have photographs of the two-row wampum and the covenant chain belt that they've pasted to this paper document, this petition that they've sent. And within the space of 3 or 4 pages, they give the King of England a crash course in the history and diplomacy of Haudenosaunee wampum belt diplomacy, saying, you know, this was a covenant going back with, well, what, George III would have been, what, a great-great-grandfather to King George V at the time of the First World War, but saying your great-great-grandfather was aware of this, you should be aware of this too. These kids have enlisted underage, so send them home. And as support for that, we're invoking the two-row wampum and the covenant chain wampum belt. And especially with the covenant chain, it's basically a metaphor for this notion of trading and economic partnerships during peacetime with the British Crown and the Six Nations Confederacy and military alliance in war. So,
Okay, do we have another question or comment?
I've got a copy. I'm a nerd, so I do these kinds of things. I've got a copy of the covenant chain belt in my knapsack here.
Make note that there is one comment from the chat on Zoom, which I'll come to in a moment, but I'll and make his display first.
Oh, well, anyways, that's what the covenant chain wampum belt looks like. There are 2 or 3 designs in particular that are especially profound. There's the what's known as the Hiawatha belt, which in this particular case is actually in this beaded wristband that I have on, and it's a schematic diagram of the original 5 nations going from west to east: the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. The Tuscarora joined the Confederacy in about 1720 or thereabouts, thus forming the Six Nations Confederacy proper. There's the two-row wampum belt, initially undertaken with the Dutch and essentially signaling this notion of sovereignty association. It's 2 parallel lines, 2 parallel purple lines against a white background. And then what's known here is the covenant chain belt. And again, with one figure representing the Six Nations Confederacy of Iroquois and allied Indian nations, and the other representing the British Crown. And again, the basic premise is trading and economic partnerships in peace and military alliance in war. So,
All right.
Thank you. Okay, so the question from our Zoom chat, wondering if it's okay to ask whether panelists know of Munsee kin who also have Wampum heritage. I am a new professor at Princeton and also the convener of a new initiative called the Wangunk Studies Working Group, having previously taught on Wangunk ancestral lands in central Connecticut at Wesleyan University for 24 years. It's my understanding that Wangunk individuals folded into Tungsis, then to Stockbridge, and so forth. So I apologize if I mispronounced any of that.
It's okay.
I would refer the questioner to the celestial bear comes down to earth, which is, you know, everybody's heard from earlier this morning. That's essentially the ethno-history of our small band, Munsee Mohican Band of Delaware at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. Within there, it traces the movement almost directly, like due westward from New England west. And the bottom line is that a lot of the Algonquin-speaking groups become refugees very early on and are widely dispersed early on. As they move west, they get folded into Lenape-speaking communities, and as those communities move ever west, by the time they get to like Fort Niagara and the Niagara Falls region as of 1784, it's essentially a refugee band which is taken into the Six Nations Confederacy under the wing of the Cayuga, and it's under Cayuga's sponsorship that we're allowed to settle at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. But there's reference to some of these small bands within the celestial bear comes down to earth. So.
Great, thank you so much. And I see we've added that to the chat as well. So I think we might have time for another question or a comment if anyone has anything more they want to add. Okay, I think that's a long enough pause to be certain that people are ready to eat. So I'll thank our panelists again. Can we all thank our panelists with one more round of applause?
We're getting ready for trick-or-treating here.
Well, enjoy.
Yeah, trick or treat.
Well, thank you very much, everyone.